During the Golden Age of Piracy, pirates either gave or got a lot of different kinds of fines. People who were pirates were tortured, flogged, and humiliated in public. When pirates were caught, they were given harsh punishments like long jail terms, being sent to work in the dangerous mines of Africa, or being hanged in public. Punishments between pirates. Floggings. It was normal on all types of ships during that time to use a whip to punish people. Pirates were much less likely to have to deal with this kind of treatment because captains rarely dared to do it to a group that probably became pirates in the first place to get away from the harsh parts of life at sea. When someone broke one of the ship's articles, which were the rules they swore to follow, the whole crew, or at least most of them, would generally agree that they should be flogged as punishment. On a pirate ship, the quartermaster was the person who beat people up. People were flogged for things like taking women on board, hitting another man, or not keeping their weapons in a good state of readiness. A mariner was beaten by tying him to the mast or a grating and using a cat-o'-nine-tails to hit him on the back. These unique whips were made up of 9 pieces of rope, each about 1/4 of an inch wide and up to 2 feet long. Each of the 9 lengths had 3 or more knots that made the bite of the whip even sharper. For worse crimes, more knots were sometimes added. The sailor would often bite a bullet while being flogged so that he wouldn't cry out and make his captain and crew laugh. In the event that he did cry out in pain, his friends would call him a nightingale in a mean way. Even though they knew that being marooned would only make them thirsty and hungry, some Marines asked to be shot right away. Punishments. Between pirates. Keel hauling. Keel hauling was the worst penalty a sailor could expect to receive short of death, and even in this situation, his chances of surviving the ordeal were little more than 50%. Keel hauling was the harshest punishment a sailor could expect to receive. The punishment consisted of tying a person with rope, dumping them overboard, and then dragging them either under the ship from one side to the other or by pulling them along the entire length of the ship. In the event that the victim prevented themselves from drowning, they would nevertheless suffer severe cuts and bruises as a result of being dragged against the barnacle-covered hull of the ship. Punishments between pirates. Marooning. Marines who are found guilty of a major crime like mutiny, theft, or being a coward could get the death penalty put off for a while. The sailors were marooned, which means they were left on a remote island with only a gun and a keg of water. Sometimes they were even stripped naked. Instead of leaving the person on land, they could be set free in a small boat with only 1 or no oars. The Marines knew they were going to die of thirst and hunger, so some of them asked to be shot right away. For others, getting a gun as a gift let them end things before the lack of comfort drove them crazy. Alexander Selkirk was the most famous sailor who got stuck at sea. He was left on the Juan Fernandez Islands in the Pacific in 1704. Edward Lowe was another man who got stuck because his crew had had enough of his cruel behavior with both friends and foes. The word maroon comes from the Spanish word for a runaway slave, cimarron, which also means wild or untamed. Punishments on innocent captives. Torture. Most pirates only cared about taking treasure, but some masters were especially mean to crews they caught, especially if they thought the crews were hiding valuables on board. Some people also thought that torturing a few people would quickly get the word out to merchant ships, making the company much more likely to follow orders the next time they were captured. People were tortured by being hit, whipped, cut, and having lit matches put between their fingers. This was sometimes called pirate persuasions as a euphemism. One popular method that was based on what the earlier buccaneers did was to tie a cord around the head of a prisoner and pull it tight until the eyes came out. For some pirates, ducking at the yardarm was a way to get prisoners to talk, just like it was used in the Royal Navy. To do this, a rope was wrapped around the victim's waist and under their groin and arms. They were then lifted up a yardarm. After the rope was dropped, the subject fell into the water for a short time. They were then pulled back up and dropped again and again until they spoke. A Portuguese captain, who threw his purse overboard, had his lips cut off and burned in front of him. Charles Vane, an English pirate who was killed in 1721, was especially cruel. At Vane's trial, witnesses and past victims talked about all the horrible things he did to torture people. Mariners got hit, cut, and even hung. One person was abused with burning matches while being tied to the ship's bowsprit. Henry Every was another well-known English pirate. In 1695, he took the Ganij Isawai, which was the Mughal emperor's prize ship. Many of the people who were caught were raped, killed, and thrown overboard after being tortured to get them to give up their valuables. Black Bart Roberts, a Welshman born around 1682 and died in 1722, was another cruel captain. Captain Roberts was very good at taking many ships, but he still tortured people for no reason. In October 1720, Roberts told his men to cut off the ears of a group of Dutch prisoners. Some of them were hanged, and their bodies were used for target practice. Roberts also hung the ruler of Martinique from his own yardarm at another time. Edward Lowe, an Englishman who sailed in the Caribbean and Eastern Atlantic from 1721 to 1724, was the cruelest pirate of all time. Ned Lowe made a list of all the horrible things he did. In 1722, he killed and hung a group of Portuguese tourists that included 2 friars. A French ship's cook was tied to the mast, and the ship caught fire and sank. A Portuguese captain who threw his purse overboard had his lips cut off and burned in front of him. A fisherman who was caught off the coast of Nantucket had his ears cut off and was then shot to death. One fisherman had to eat his own ears, and another prisoner had to eat the heart of a captain who was taken off the coast of Rhode Island. In the same way, a gunner on the English pirate ship Edmund Condent is said to have cooked and eaten the heart of an Indian prisoner who had threatened to blow up the pirate ship. Another captain, who liked to hurt his victims, was Condent. He cut off the noses and ears of several Portuguese prisoners of war off the coast of Brazil. Punishments on innocent captives. Humiliations. Certain games that pirates created for their prisoners were so cruel that they were on the verge of being tortured. One of these sports was called blooding and sweating, and it consisted of forcing a hostage run across a line of sailors who used sail needles to stab the victim as they passed by. After that, the victim was placed inside a barrel that was stuffed with cockroaches. Making the victim run around the mainmast indefinitely was a more gentle method that might be performed. Using the tip of a cutlass, the perpetrator attempted to convince the victim to continue running until they became so exhausted that they passed out. Punishments on innocent captives. Walking the plank. People were blinded, had their hands tied, and then had to walk out on a plank sticking out from the deck over the water. There isn't a lot of proof that pirates did this during the Golden Age. Still, the punishment has been used in many made-up pirate stories, and some sources say that Stede Bonnet came up with it as a way to entertain his crew and get rid of people he didn't want. This odd way of killing people may have come from Cilician pirates in the 1st century BCE, who, according to Plutarch, made Roman prisoners walk along a ladder on the water. Marines who were thought to be drunk were often made to walk in a straight line along a plank that was laid out on deck. Punishments for captured pirates. Flogging and branding. During the Golden Age, the British Admiralty allowed the East India Company to hunt down and try pirates in the Indian Ocean, starting in 1683. As a result, pirates could now get what was coming to them wherever they made trouble. Someone who did something wrong was often flogged on one ship or sent around all the ships in the harbor and whipped at each one. This was also done in the Royal Navy. There were so many pirates in the Indian Ocean that people who were caught were often marked with a red-hot iron with the letter P. In this part of the world, pirates were put to death by hanging them from a yardarm. Punishments for captured pirates. Prison. Early in the Golden Age, some pirates were let go if they were caught. This was especially true if they were very young men or minor members of the crew. As time went on and hacking got worse, the government became much stricter. Pirates all over the world knew that jail time was the worst thing that could happen if they were caught. A lot of pirates died while they were being tried, either from their wounds or from the many diseases that spread in jails. Most of them were pretty sure they would get a long prison term if they couldn't prove to the court that they had been forced to join a pirate crew. The pirates, most of whom had no education at all, had to do this defense on their own because they were not allowed to have a lawyer. Even though jails in England were not much better than those in the colonies, they were still pretty bad. In some prison sentences, inmates had to work hard. For example, in West African penal colonies, prisoners had to work in mines, where their chances of survival were very low. Punishments for captured pirates: hangings. Toward the end of the Golden Age, hanging a pirate as a punishment was the most popular choice. This was usually done right after the trial. People were put to death in public, and passing sailors would often be able to see the act. Pirates in London had their own place to be put to death. It was called Execution Dock, and it was in Wapping, on the bank of the River Thames. Usually, several pirates were hung together. This was especially true when the war against piracy got tougher, and whole ships were sentenced all at once. The condemned men were led out of jail, which was usually Newgate or Marshalsea, by an officer carrying a silver oar, which stood for the High Court of the Admiralty's power. There were a few very important spots in the area where the hanging took place. When the location was close to the water, it meant that the crimes had been committed by sailors. When it was exactly at low tide, it meant that the Admiralty was in charge of carrying out the sentence, since crimes that happened beyond low tide were handled by the civil officials. The men who were being put to death stood on the simple wooden gallows while a priest said his piece and prayed for those who were about to die. The men were then given the chance to say their last words. These talks were often recorded and printed for a public eager to read them. Then the pirate was pushed off the ladder he had climbed. Most of the time, he died of being choked rather than having his neck broken. The body was set out on the beach or tied to a wooden post and left there for 3 tides after it was dead. The bodies were then placed in a grave that wasn't marked. The people in charge of putting people to death in the colonies, who had that power since 1701, followed this process. In 1722, the biggest group of people were put to death at Cape Coast Castle in Guinea, West Africa, during the Golden Age. 52 of the crew members of the Bartholomew Roberts that were caught were hung there. For pirates who were really bad, like leaders, their bodies were hung to rot in an iron cage until they rotted. From about 1645 to 1701, Captain Kidd was a Scottish privateer who turned into a pirate. He was found guilty of piracy and murder in London in May 1701. After he was hanged, his body was tarred and put in a cage by the River Thames. For 2 years, ships that were passing could see Kidd's body. Even after 20 years, this kind of punishment was still being used. John Rackham, an English pirate also known as Calico Jack, was killed in Jamaica in November 1720 after being found guilty of 4 high seas crimes. His body was also hung in a cage to scare people away, but this time it was on Dead Man's Cay of Port Royal, which is a good name for it. The same thing happened to Charles Vane a year later. Not a lot of good feelings existed between pirates and the authorities. In fact, this made pirates fight even harder to avoid being caught alive. Ed Teach, also known as Blackbeard, had to be shot 5 times and cut 20 times with a sword before he finally died in November 1718. Lieutenant Maynard put Blackbeard's head on the bow of his ship as a warning to other pirates after he had caught him. When Bartholomew Roberts was killed in battle in February 1722, he told his men to bury him at sea so that his body wouldn't end up in a cage. They did what he told them to do. One thing was for sure. Pirates couldn't say they didn't know the terrible sentences they were in store for when they were finally caught and put in jail, which almost all of them were. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict. And please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.